In this video, I want to just use kind of a practical example for you to show the benefit of studying the Bible from a much more grammatical approach. And I just want to use one verse, Ephesians 5:18. I wrote plus out there because I'll probably show how some of the verses right after it kind of flow out of that. But I just want to kind of take a second to talk about just the practicalities of this so you can see it yourself. Because by now you should have read through the notes and you should have read through the book and starting to kind of wrap your mind around these concepts. And one of the things that you'll see in the book as we talk about, or in my notes, are the 8 parts of speech. And so if you're new at this and you're trying to go, okay, well, how do I start really exegeting Scripture from a more grammatical perspective so I'm consistent with these principles that I'm being taught? How do I go about doing that? One of the things you can do is you can just take a verse like this and go through every word and find its part of speech. So you can take Ephesians 5:18 and you'll see, at least I'm reading from the ESV here, at least from the ESV you'll see the word and you can just go in and write, that is a conjunction. And then you'll see it says, do not get drunk. Well, not is a negative statement, so you say, do get drunk. That's a verb. Not is modifying that verb, so it's an adverb. With is a preposition. Wine is a noun. For is a conjunction, and you can go on, and you can do that with every word. I realize at first that would seem extremely tedious, and you're kind of like, why would I do that? What you'll start to realize is the more that we talk about grammar, you'll see that those 8 parts of speech that we talk about are their forms. There's 8 forms, if you will, in the English language of how a word can be. But when you find that, right, if it's a noun or a verb or on down the line, all you have done is just found what form it's in. That doesn't really help you. Ultimately, you have to be asking yourself the question, what's its function? And inherent within our English forms is how it functions in the sentence. And they can have various forms, but that's how you ultimately find that. Same thing works like that in the original languages. In the original languages, they have forms that are somewhat different than what we have in English, and those forms determine what their function really is. And so what we're trying to do here is just use Ephesians 5:18 to kind of take some time. So you might want to just pause this video if you want to practice yourself. Pause this video right here. Take Ephesians 5:18 and see if you can just work through all the words in the sentence and figure out what form they're in. Noun, verb, adverb, adjective, on down the line. Just write it down and just see how well you do, and then you can unpause this video and I'll just show you in practice. Okay? So, Paul says, and obviously tying you back to what he has been saying, this is a conjunction, they join together. See, just using that as an example, here is a conjunction in its form, and what do conjunctions do in their function, but they join. So an and is continuing a thought. So that means at least up to 5:17, and that would be, if you were to go back and read, you can see that is the case, that 5:18 is a continuing thought from 5:17. Okay? He goes on and he says, do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. Now, I have picked Ephesians 5:18 because all the various forms, if you have that by now, you can look at it and kind of see how they work together. And in our English, the way English works is that our sentences are built around the subject and the verb. Okay, so what we have here is, in verse 18, a command, a negative command to not do something. Command to not get drunk. So the first verb that we find is a command to not get drunk. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just draw this up here and put do get drunk. And I realize that looks kind of weird when I first write it up there, with the idea of that not modifying. Do not get drunk. Since it's a command, in English, there's always an implied you subject. Okay, so Paul is telling us to not get drunk. Let me skip down. But he contrasts this command with a second command, a positive command, which says, be filled. So just like this one, you have the statement you, the implied you, followed by the verb be filled. And so what you're seeing is how these two, connected by this conjunction, which makes them contrasting one another, how you have a negative command followed by a positive command. That helps us for interpretation purposes, because if you see they're contrasting, one is going to help interpret the other. Okay? Now with that said, then once you have found the subject, verb, in this case there happens to be two in the sentence, then you can start to see how it all fits together. In this particular case, he says, and do not get drunk, and he defines it with wine. So now he's telling you what you're not to get drunk with, and he goes on and he explains that. He says, for, notice the conjunction, right? The conjunction for is telling us, really actually that shouldn't be coming down from here, sorry about that. Coming down from here, where he explains, for that is, and he uses a word that in English maybe we don't use as much today, but here in the ESV is debauchery. Okay? You can see here that this conjunction is tied back to the verb. There's going to be times as you're observing and as you're working through this, you'll have to figure out where it goes. You might say, well, it goes with this or it goes with something else, and that'll be a part of your exegesis, is trying to figure it out. Here it seems pretty clear that he is explaining why we are not to get drunk with wine. Why? For, or because, that is debauchery. And then he says, but you be filled, and the ESV puts with the Spirit. With the Spirit. Okay? This is a preposition. Once again, talking about, in some form or fashion, what you have modifying that verb. If you're looking at different translations here, one of the observations you might make as you compare is that some of these will say, be filled by the Spirit. If you were looking at maybe a Greek parallel, you might see that one of the options is in the Spirit, and in that you will see various differences that you're going to need to deal with when you actually interpret this passage. But one of the things I just hope you see out of this video is when you are able to kind of go through and define the parts of speech, then you can start to see, okay, if that's a verb, if that's a preposition, what's that preposition going with? If that's a conjunction, what is it tied to? What it gets you to start doing is to start taking how it was written and start letting that be what drives. You imagine right now if I were to just say, okay, now take an hour and start doing observations with just this alone, how your observations are going to change. Because you're starting to see the connection. Oh, wow, that actually explains this. And this is actually contrasted with this. And this is a negative command. And this is a positive command. And you start to see the comparison with not getting drunk with wine, in comparison being filled the Spirit, and maybe why all of a sudden he uses this verb because of the command here and on down the line. One of the other things I want you to notice, and particularly if you're reading from an ESV, and I'm going to just kind of draw this way over here, is one of the things that you may notice is coming in verses 19, 20, and 21, you have 5 statements where he says, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns, and psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your hearts to the Lord. He talks about giving thanks to the Father through the Son. And again, in the ESV does a good job of translating this in verse 21, where it's translated submitting to one another in the fear of the Lord. You'll see that all of these here, I didn't do this one, hopefully you'll notice this, that all of these have the ing, 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 ing. 5 in a row. Right? And one of the benefits of grammar is when you start to see this, you start to see how all of these things are brought together. Because on first reading, if you're reading verse 18, verse 19, verse 20, verse 21, just a simple English reading without really thinking grammatically about it, you could think that Paul gives 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 commands. When you stop and evaluate this from a grammatical perspective, you'll realize he gives one command followed by 2 commands. You'll see how intimately tied those 2 commands are together, that they're meant to be understood together. And what you'll see with all of these, if you remember, these are verbals called participles, and that these participles are actually growing out of and in some form or fashion modifying the command to be filled in the Spirit. And so one of the great things, if you notice that and you observe that when you get to the interpretation stage, the question that you'll be asking is, how do these 5 participles listed subsequent to this verb, how do they modify it? And there's some pretty significant theological implications depending on your exegesis. If you say that these 5 participles are the result of being filled in the Spirit, that's going to affect your spirituality, your Christian existence, in a different way than if you say all 5 of these are telling you how to do this right here. Now all of a sudden you say, if I want to be filled with the Spirit, I've got to speak and sing and make melody and give thanks and submit to one another. In comparison to if you see them as the results growing out of it, you say, I must first be filled in the Spirit so that I will speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So they'll sing and make melody in your heart to my heart to the Lord on down the line. And so you can see that what we're ultimately getting at is trying to let exegesis draw out. In class, a lot of times if I use this example, people will go, well, I think it means... And I'll stop them and I'll say, well, wait a second. What I'm really trying to get you to do is to not say, I think that these 5 are telling me how to do this, or I think you must first do this and these grow out of it. I want them to be able to observe the connection, and then when they get to the interpretation stage, to be able to wrestle with the resources that are available to them, to ask the question, what does the original grammar demand of the text? And whichever one it does, that's the one that we go, okay, based on good exegesis that is driven by grammatical analysis, analysis of the language as it was written, that's the one that we ultimately submit ourselves to, no matter what our preconceived theological bias may have been prior to studying it. And that way, we can really start to let Scripture transform us. Okay? So, guys, hopefully you see from this the benefit of studying the Bible grammatically. I've used one verse just to try to make it really, really simple. The thing is, the more you start to do this, the less you'll have to go in and go, that's a conjunction and that's a verb. And the more you'll just start to read like that naturally. And the more you start to read like that naturally, the more you'll realize that you can read through whole letters and whole books, and you're starting to see those connections inherently because your mind is being trained to read the Bible from a grammatical point of view. And at that point in time, it'll be far less, grammar, and it'll be far more just letting the Scripture come alive through the language in which it was written.